Welcome to another session on Thoughts on International Business, Marketing and Strategy. My name is Michael Czinkota and I'm a professor with the Georgetown University McDonough School of Business. I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Charles Skuba, also here at Georgetown University. And the topic we're addressing today is corruption and insincerity in international business. Now, to start out with, you may have seen one of our earlier transmittals where we talked about the European currency. And one big issue which really triggered a run on the currency were comments by the chairman of Deutsche Bank, Mr. Ackermann, who in a television interview was overcome by an attack of honesty, namely saying he did not have any belief that the Greeks would pay back the government obligations they were issued. And of course, if the chairman of the largest German bank says that, that becomes worrisome. But it also tells us that there are other situations, for example, in Hungary, where a government leader before this year's election in April announced to his followers that we should do anything, lie, cheat, steal, in order to win this election. Now, maybe many expect this for politicians to be thought of, but few expect this to be actually recorded and said in public. So honesty is not necessarily always something that totally pays back immediately, but more importantly, lack of honesty and corruption plays even a greater role and brings with it greater difficulty. Now, in the United States, we have since 1977 the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA for short. Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about what this act is and why that's relevant today?
Well, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a mark, a line in the sand, essentially, for U.S. businesses. The United States government, essentially the Department of Justice, and certainly the Securities and Exchange Commission, take corruption, bribery, white-collar crime in international dealings, certainly in domestic dealings as well, very, very seriously. U.S. corporations are expected to comply with the letter of the law and are not allowed to engage in any activities involving bribery or particularly bribery, but any violations of the specifics of this act. We've seen a steady increase in the number of enforcement actions by the Department of Justice in relation to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In 2009, although corporate enforcement actions were slightly down, there was a steep rise in individual enforcement actions by the U.S. government. I think it's a trend that will continue on an individual basis. On the corporate side, many corporations, U.S. corporations now engaged in international business, take this very seriously and have engaged in compliance procedures, have established departments, compliance departments, and have instituted rigorous internal rules to guard against this kind of action or against this kind of corruption. So U.S. businesses are held to a high standard and they are following it.
Well, it's interesting you say that because the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act does clearly lay down the law. You cannot buy business. You cannot bribe people. You may facilitate some actions, for example, give a few dollars to a passport official so he'll let you go through, to do, in other words, what he was supposed to do anyway. But you cannot pervert the flow of business by buying actions. Many American companies have complained that the U.S. is setting too much stake in leadership globally and that they are placed at a disadvantage compared to other nations. And I tell you, in early 2010, I attended an OECD meeting, Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, and the discussion there was how much corruption had been reduced. So I actually put out a note on my blog asking is this the end of corruption? And you should have seen the response. People were saying, we wish it were, but it certainly isn't. There are many companies still with nefarious actions in terms of attracting business. We have large companies. You mentioned Siemens.
Yes.
What's going on there?
Well, at the end of 2008, Siemens paid or agreed to pay an $800 million settlement with the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission for what was called systemic bribery of foreign government officials. Siemens also has got a settlement with the World Bank, and which is interesting because really corruption extracts a high toll in developing countries where it is often most practiced. Corruption basically undermines economic development, and it robs the very people who need the most help, the economies and the polities of these developing countries. It really destabilizes and undermines them. So it's a terrible affliction we have in international business. I give the United States government an enormous amount of credit. And not only the United States government, the British government also has a serious effort. They have their FSO, foreign, I forget exactly what it's. It's a FSO. Anyway, I apologize for that. But
no, quite right. And the key point is that corruption is a terrible waste for the individual who needs help the most. And it really increasingly, I think what we're seeing is what one could almost call the wheel of corruption. You have a government in office which is corrupt. The opposition runs in opposition due to that corruption and says, when we get in, we will clean house. Then they get elected, they start cleaning house, but then they shortly afterwards discover how nice it is to take funds from the outside. So the existing government then becomes corrupt, and the corrupter ones who had been ejected before now become the new guardians of fairness. And this wheel keeps going on, and it's just terrible to see that these new brooms don't sweep for too long, and competitiveness of nations is affected, as is the standard of living of the population.
Yeah. Yes, and in 2009, the OECD also created a new set of guidelines and published a new set of guidelines to raise awareness of corruption and bribery activities. I think this is a positive step forward. One of the things we need to see is not only the member nations of the OECD sign on to this. I know another handful of nations have done it, but we have to broaden the extent of the signatories of those OECD guidelines.
And it's important to abide by these rules, because if you start ignoring some laws, that leads to increased ignoring of others. And that does not make society a better one. Well, so much for that today. Next time we will talk about international trade in services. We'll reveal the secrets of medical tourism. I thank you for coming to watch us.